Welcome to this session of the AI and Data Exchange. My guest today is Max Claps, a research director for IDC Insights. Max, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
It's great to be here with you.
There's so much going on around the federal sector of AI, and I think this would be a really great conversation to dig into some of those trends, to understanding from a researcher's perspective and from someone who looks at kind of the 50,000-foot view about how AI data is really impacting the federal sector, the federal workforce, federal mission areas. But I'm going to start there. Your role at IDC, just give me a little bit. What do you focus on? Discuss your role.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been an IDCer, as I say, on and off for almost 23 years, right? Since 2002. In between, I have spent time with one of our competitors and one of the big vendors that also we work with. I was part of their public sector strategy team globally. Right now, what I do at IDC, I am responsible for what we call our national government platforms and technologies research, which in a nutshell means anything that has to do with technology applied to federal civilian government on a worldwide basis.
All right, there's several governments out there. How do you keep track of everything that goes on, right? So I appreciate that that's worldwide. We're going to obviously focus on the federal government for the U.S. today. Let's start there. There's been a big push over the last 15, 20, 25 years to use data, new, better ways to really drive decision making. What's some of those trends you're seeing around data use, data management? Tell us what you're seeing in the federal sector.
Yeah. So first of all, it is a challenge to keep track of what happens globally, but it's also what it makes interesting. I must say that I'm not alone in the effort, right? My anchor is US federal government. 80% of what I do is dedicated to US federal government right now. And I have colleagues that look at what happens in EMEA or Asia Pac. So that helps me figure out things and make sure I don't lose track of too many things along the way. And I really appreciate you starting from data, right? Because every conversation nowadays starts with AI, but AI doesn't exist without data, right? So that's the foundational work that governments need to do. And as you say, it's not new, but it takes a different perspective, a different level of importance with AI, right? When we were in the wave of data for reporting and dashboards, and then the way of data for advanced analytics. And then we had a way where we were discussing about structured and unstructured data, how to bring them together. Now, all of those things have been surpassed by AI and by Gen AI in particular, because AI and Gen AI enables federal government mission worker, back office workers to leverage the value of data in a much bigger and more comprehensive way. But that doesn't mean the background work on the data platform, the data governance, data quality, the data pipelines is less important. It's probably even more important, right? One of our predictions for 2025 is that governments will invest much more in data quality and data sharing to make sure that there are the right data sets available for AI training, fine-tuning, grounding, and inferencing to get the right output from AI, right? Otherwise, it's the usual garbage in, garbage out, no matter how intelligent the algorithm is.
Let's start with that investment of data quality, data sharing. A lot of agencies we know have been focused on data quality for several years, data governance, data management. Are there specific areas that they're now moving into, or is it, I don't want to say more of the same, because these things always kind of change, evolve, but it's the same, very similar focus that we've seen over the last, again, 5-7 years?
I don't think it's necessarily just more of the same, right? It's a different approach, because when the objective was in many agencies to have the ability to extract data from a system of record, a repository, to visualize and take a look at what had happened in the past and run some analysis. The approach was to create a data warehouse and then maybe a data lake, because you wanted to have some unstructured data, you wanted to have some real-time streaming data. So it was more about the type of data and data sources that you had to care for that required to take different architectural approaches. Now with AI, the styles of computing that enable to bring data together, to have good quality data, and to manage the higher level of complexity from a governance perspective, is expanding even more, right? Because you have vector databases that have a very specific purposes. You have maybe a data layer in case management application or in workflow automation software platforms. And then you have a data layer that sits on top of an application itself. And then you have an agent that is embedded in some task automation and functionality. So it's not more of the same. It's actually a proliferation of different approaches to architecture, higher ability, more sophisticated ability to do governance over that data, to make sure that with all of these dependencies, the risks don't grow and go unobserved in a way. So I don't think it's just more of the same. It's more sophisticated and more complicated in a way.
I think the one thing that AI has done, and we will get to AI, of course, as part of our conversation, is made that structured versus unstructured data piece more palatable, right? In the past, I've always heard, well, we're really good with structured data. We know what we have. We know all the taxonomies around it. But it's when a call center comes in and someone says, hey, I have a complaint about XYZ, we really struggle to kind of understand what those call centers. I think the AI has allowed agencies to get their arms around unstructured data in a bigger way. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Absolutely. So a couple of things. When we think of AI, and we can probably go back to that later in the interview, we think of different swim lanes in a way, right? And there are certain areas where AI is already running and certain areas where federal agencies are sort of walking and areas where they're crawling in terms of making an impact with AI. And if you think of IT ops or the software development and development life cycle, they're probably in the running stages, right? The data ops is an area where AI and Gen AI in particular has accelerated and quickly brought them from the crawling stage to the walking and moving towards the running stage. So all of the data classification, data tagging, metadata, data quality, data interpretation, and pipelining, it's really accelerated also on the unstructured front, precisely because of AI. And traditional AI and machine learning with natural language recognition have started that trend. But now with large language models, it's been brought to the next level, not necessarily in terms of full-scale production, but the opportunities that technology has opened up also for a customer service agent that had no way of looking through hundreds of PDF documents.
I love obviously the crawl, walk, run, but in case folks maybe aren't as familiar with this idea of data ops, just give me a quick definition. What do you mean by that? Because you're saying that's where they're really accelerating their path to understanding unstructured data.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me clarify that the swim lanes that we see in AI are five swim lanes, as I call them. So the run swim lanes are IT ops, which you can think of as service desk, provisioning of computing, observability, some cybersecurity and threat intelligence tasks. The second swim lane is really around, as I said, the software development and deployment life cycle. So code documentation, right? Digging into legacy code and figuring out what is the logic of that code when you don't have any more of the skills to do that. Code refactoring, business requirements documentation. So that is being very, very much impacted by Gen AI. Data ops is all of the area around data preparation, data ingestion, data tagging, data pipelining. So creating the basis and automating all of the tasks that then enable the business users, the analysts, the policy experts to then build insights, simulate future scenarios, predict what could happen depending on the changes they can make to a program or how they respond to a request or a complaint from a citizen. And then the other two swim lanes are more around the business functions and the business tasks that can be automated by AI. And the simple distinction there is the horizontal business functions like HR, procurement, recruitment, and finance versus the mission specific, right? So AI applied by Customs and Borders Protection to interpret X-ray machine data to see if there are things that they need to be alerted about. And that's a mission-specific AI application.
Thanks for that kind of clarification. I think a lot of folks hear all these kind of big terminologies that you focus on and go, okay, what am I really doing? So putting a little more clarity on it is really helpful. The last piece about data, and then I think we should move over to AI because obviously there's a lot of interest there. When it comes to some of the trends you're seeing, it always comes back to, okay, what's the strategy? What's the governance? How do we make sure that we are sharing? Is that still the biggest culture issue that you're seeing as you do your research, that people want to hug their data? We used to talk about hugging servers. Now, well, my data is really important to me, and I don't know, Max, I know you're in my agency or you're the agency next to me. I don't know if I trust you. Is that really what's still standing in the way of kind of taking more advantage of data? Is that culture issue?
I think it is. I think it is, to be honest with you. And it has broader ramifications now that there's, of course, a global debate about data sovereignty and AI sovereignty. So the question is not only do I share within my agency with one of the bureaus or two of the bureaus in my agencies, not even with another department, but what is the implication if, for example, I am NASA or NIH or CDC, and I have mechanisms in place that right now are very manual, but they exist to share data with some international research institutions, right, that want to get access to my data. And I may benefit from that, but there are questions of intellectual property, how it impacts the competitiveness of US as a country going forward. So definitely there's a regulatory nuance, but there's a cultural and mindset element to that hugging my data that makes it quite difficult.
That culture piece, no matter how much we've talked about secure data sharing, that idea of, well, we're all in one government together, one organization together, that always seems to be the biggest challenge. Let's talk a little bit about AI now. Same question, trends you're seeing around AI, generative AI, and how are those trends different? I've talked to some vendors who say, we're not really focused on Gen AI, we're really focused just on providing some AI tools. And other people are like all in on the Gen AI and think it's the next thing since, sliced bread. So let's talk trends.
Yeah, so first of all, it's very clear that the first year after ChatGPT was released, because that was the inflection point, right? The democratization that ChatGPT brought, as well as the increased awareness around the potential risks, generated a lot of interest and a lot of hype, which for the federal government materialized into tons of POCs, or at least tons of ideas around use cases where Gen AI could be applied, and also trying to figure out how that was different from the traditional AI and machine learning that we're already applying, for example, to counter fraud in some of the benefits area or by the IRS and so forth and so on. So it took 8 to 12 months to clear the hype, but I think we're well past that, right? All of the vendors and the federal government executives that I talk to are very much getting a grasp with reality, which for the federal government buyers means narrowing down on the number of use cases that they can or they want to scale and put in production. And we can talk about the 700 versus 1,700 use cases that have been inventoried, but that's a different story. But I think they add very much focus on which of these use cases can provide the ROI that we need for our mission and our program. For the vendor community, of course, they wanted Gen AI to be the best thing since sliced bread because they're constantly looking for the new big opportunity, and that's rightly so. It's their job. But if you see how they're becoming more sophisticated in terms of how they are building government-specific use cases, they're starting to talk about government-specific agents, how also the consumption models, right? Instead of expecting the government to buy an extra SKU from them, they embed Gen AI capabilities into the next release of their standard products, because that is a much better way for the government to consume, and how, of course, the product companies are working with professional services firm to help the government realize the ROI and scale the use cases that really matter. So I think back to the previous point, we're really past the hype and everybody wants to talk about the practical implications.
I'm glad to hear that you think we're past the hype. Sometimes it's hard to say when that hype cycle ends. It feels like we've been in the zero trust hype for several years. That actually seems to have calmed down. It feels like there's still we're a little bit into the AI hype cycle, but maybe we're on the downward hill now. We're on the downhill, so that's the best part of the ride, right? If you're a bike rider, the uphill is always worse, down's always better. So I love the fact you broke this down between how federal agencies are looking at it and vendors. I definitely want to get to the vendor piece. And you mentioned the 1,700 use cases that the Office of Management and Budget kind of highlighted as part of their update from in December. Walk me through what stood out to you. What are some of the things when you say how are agencies applying AI, data tools, capabilities, as it relates to kind of getting that ROI, getting that kind of best for the mission?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, the fact that in the previous iteration there were only 700 and now there's 1,700. Actually, the latest release that came out January 25th has 2,133, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm not worried too much about the absolute number because I think some of it has to do with agencies that got better at reporting, that recognized use cases with more granularity and so forth and so on. So I don't think they doubled, right, or more than doubled. It's just a factor of how sophisticated and mature the federal agencies and bureaus became in recognizing the value and the differences among those. What is more interesting to look at is some of the agencies that report the highest number of use cases are more or less the same across the 2.5 years since the reporting became a requirement from OMB, right? So some of the Health and Human Services agencies, the public safety and security area, homeland security type of agencies are very much on the front end of experimenting. VA of course, because it has all of an entire subset of use cases that has to do with health, right? Healthcare and medical tasks for the veterans that they're assisting in their hospitals and so forth and so on. So I'm not too surprised about the concentration of use cases around a couple of agencies. I'm very intrigued by two things. The first one is back to the swim lanes that we were talking about. There's a little bit of a shift across the swim lanes, right? When I took a look at the 700 use cases a year and a half ago, there were a lot around data ops. There were a lot about IT and software development. Some, of course, that had to do with business functions, but a lot of them were internally facing, a lot of HR chatbots, and so forth and so on. And now there's much more on the mission end, right? Mission use cases. Again, we're still probably in the crawl stage for many agencies, but it's interesting to see how it's drifting down into where it can really make an impact for the public. The second thing that I find interesting as to observe was the distribution of use cases between those that are operational, those that are being ideated or piloted, and those that are at the acquisition and development stage, and also those that are being or have been retired, right? Because if you have an agency that has a lot of retired use cases, you may say they failed miserably with AI. Actually, I think that's a positive indication potentially, because it means they have a good AI innovation process in place that says this is a gate, and we have 20%, 30% of our AI use cases that did not pass that gate because they did not prove their value. Let's retire them, right? If there's an agency that only has operational use cases, but no retired use case, no case in ideation, it means either they stopped innovating and they're only trying to sweat their existing assets, or they have too much on their plate. They're trying to operate too many use cases, then they've not thought of reprioritizing and saying, maybe this one is not delivering. Let's repurpose the resources onto something else that may deliver more value. So that breakdown is also interesting to analyze from my point of view.
Let me start with that distribution of use cases. And I think that's a really great point. It started very safe. Hey, let's do something with an HR chatbot. Hey, let's do something back office. And they say, okay, this is part of the learning. Okay, I see how that works. I get comfortable with it. Well, what if we did this that's external facing, and it's that whole kind of building. I think that that's probably very typical of most technologies, the way this is working. It's not like agencies are jumping into the deep end, let's dive in and see what happens. They're still doing that, put a toe in, put two toes in. Obviously not surprising, but what does that kind of tell you about this approach to how they're using and implementing AI?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting aspects of that dynamic that you're describing, and it's also reflected in the new inventory, is that learning curve by starting internally help them figure out the risks, right? So the new inventory has that column that says, is this a use case that is impacting individual rights, or is it impacting safety and security? And that's something that they had to learn over time, right? As they discovered what a certain algorithms could do, as they discovered if there was a bias in the data set, as they discovered if the different large language models that they were trying at different degrees of hallucinations, that helped them determine the best fit for purpose algorithm. They helped them determine what were the priority in terms of investing in more data or building some synthetic data sets to protect privacy, to train a certain algorithm, and so forth and so on. So I think that learning curve was very healthy, particularly from this perspective of how much risk taking, how they could observe those risks, and how they could prioritize actions to monitor and tackle those risks.
Max, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to get an industry perspective. I'm Jason Miller, and you're watching Federal News Network's AI and Data Exchange.